So I've been thinking a bit about how to go about mapping some of my course learning outcomes to the new AACN Essentials. And in 2021, AACN put out this publication of the Essentials for Core Competencies in Nursing Education. And when you read through this document, you'll find that they have divided these up into 10 domains, and in each of the domains they have outlined some competencies and sub-competencies. And when you go through and look at this with these competencies, there are 10 domains, 45 competencies that they've listed, and 204 sub-competencies. So this is kind of a list of the sub-competencies. You'll see that these are identified with the text of the description, and they've identified it with a competency number and letter for the different sub-competencies that are listed out here. And I went through and did a pivot table in Excel after listing these, and find there are a total of 204 of these sub-competencies. My nursing program that I work with in nursing informatics has, let's see if I can find I have 19 courses in my program that I work in. This is a Master of Nursing Informatics program, and each of these courses has 4 to 6 learning outcomes that are the main learning outcomes for the course. So that quickly seems like a pretty heavy lift to try and identify where are these sub-competencies for graduate education represented throughout our program. So I've been trying to think of how can I go about and make this mapping process a little more structured, and perhaps try to speed things up a little bit. And as I have looked at this, I think I've found something that may be a useful tool, and that is looking at some semantic similarity metrics. So this technique called S-BERT, and I'm not really experienced with it, so I've found a couple examples, but it looks like something that might provide something useful, and I've kind of got a proof of concept cobbled together. So this technique looks like it kind of first came out in 2018 and 19, and it builds on previous work looking at semantic similarity, but older work kind of worked on the word level, and when you get up to the sentence level, it would get a lot more computationally intensive and take example. And this publication says that it took finding similarity on sentences required quite a number of hours. And so this publication looked at an advancement looking at things on a sentence level using some pre-trained models. So I wanted to go through, I found a couple of examples online of identifying semantic similarity between sentences, and I will put links to these videos in the description for this. But I went through those examples and tried to see how I might be able to adapt this to my purpose. And so I wanted to go through some of this code and some of what I did just to make this, to show this example of how this may be helpful in the context of trying to map AACN Essentials to course outcomes in a graduate nursing program. So let's see what else I have for an example. So here's kind of where I started. I have my program courses and my learning outcomes. So I listed all of my learning outcomes here in an Excel sheet, gave them each an ID based on the course number, and just numbered the different outcomes. So you can see I have my different course numbers and the learning outcomes. When all said and done, I think I listed 95 learning outcomes over the different courses that I included in this group. And then on another sheet, I listed the sub-competencies, the AACN sub-competencies, again, just with a description of each sub-competency and using the ID number that they had. And so I was interested in trying to use this S-BERT resource to try and match up which sub-competencies and which learning outcomes seem to align the most closely based on semantic similarity scores. So here's a Jupyter Notebook with some Python code. If you haven't installed it, there's a Python module called SentenceTransformers that can be installed. I've already done that on my machine, so I'm not going to run this here. And this first block of code just imports the that learning outcome sheet that I showed that had our two worksheets in it, sheet 1 and sheet 2, both of them with an ID and a description. I think in the grand scheme of things, this problem of trying to match up sentences and gauge which ones seem to be the closest match is a pretty common problem. So I try to just make this simple, so this doesn't necessarily have to just be done with learning outcomes and AACN Essentials. Any kind of text matching that you're trying to do, this seems like it might be something useful. So this is just 2 sheets in an Excel workbook, and so those both get pulled in and added to a data frame in Jupyter Notebooks. And the examples that I saw were working with lists in Python, and lists are just a list of items, and so I just took the columns from the data frames and I imported them into a list of IDs from the first sheet, and a list of text, and a list of IDs from the second, and a list of text descriptions from the second sheet. And this is just an example of the sheet 2 ID numbers, and those are the same as what I had from my AACN Essentials sub-competencies. Then I went through and the models, I left a link here. There's a number of models, probably between 100 and 150. I haven't actually been through all of them yet. And this one that I'm using here seemed to work well in the online examples that I saw, so I've just used this same one. But you build a model and select the model that you want to use. And then these embeddings step, these actually convert the sentences to dense vectors. And you can go look up what these vectors are, these sentence embeddings and transformers. Use these models and create the word representations into a numerical vector format. And if you're not familiar with that, you probably It's not necessary to understand it totally to use these examples, but it's a little more involved and more detail that I'm going to explain here. So we encode our different, there's my sheet 1 text and my sheet 2 text, and I've created a couple of embeddings. And then there is a function here, Cosign Similarity, comparing the sentences in my first sheet with the sentences in my second sheet. And that gives me a set of cosine similarity scores for all of my sentence pairs. So this is just they're going to look like this, except it's going to be a large matrix with the number of dimensions, what I say, like 94, 95 by 204. That's a large matrix. And then to be able to work with this, I just wanted to try and get an idea of how I could visualize this. So I've exported these cosine similarity scores to some data frames and then back out to an Excel notebook so that I could do a little bit of sorting and look at this. So this next step is just putting these scores into a data frame, which you can see an example of here. And this has, I'm going to do the scores with the course outcomes and the sub-competencies, make two sheets, one that has them, the course outcomes down the rows, and the other one that has the course outcomes along the columns, just so that I can give myself an easier way to search depending on how I want to look at it. So you can see that this is an example of the transposed data. And then I just went and used Pandas and Python here to export this to an Excel workbook with two sheets, one with the scores and then the other one with the scores transposed, so that I can work a little more closely with it. And I'm not going to go into much detail here, but suffice to say this code goes through and creates a file on my computer, and rather than me go through and do some extra formatting, there is a way to do that with Python here to write this data out and set up a little bit of formatting so it's easier to work with. So a lot of the steps here go through and just create the Excel workbook and do some set up some formatting in it, and it does this for both sheets. So when all is said and done, I have an output sheet that looks like this. And so you'll see on this first sheet I have my course outcomes, and on my second sheet I have my sub-competencies. And what I'm interested in looking at, and these cosine similarity scores range from -1 to +1. So according to the model, you know, some sentences can be a bit divergent in their meaning. So those will end up with a negative score. As you can see, most of these are positive, but kind of similar to a Pearson correlation. A score of 0 or close to 0 means there's little semantic similarity, and a score towards 1 means it's higher. So I set up this formatting using conditional formatting, but I was able to get Python to set this up using a color scale. And what this does is scores that are closer to 0 are very light in color, and scores that are closer to 1 get darker and darker, so you can kind of just get a visual representation. And as you can see, this is a lot of scores here, so it would be kind of inefficient to look at this all at once, but using Excel, you can go to data and add a filter, and now you can sort all of these columns in ascending or descending order. And so that's where I'm most interested in. If I want to look at my sub-competencies. The other thing that I did with this is I actually added the text of the description as a note in Excel. I'm using Python, so if I want to see what a cell is, I can hover over the column heading here, and you can see that this is the first sub-competency, translate evidence from nursing science as well as other sciences into practice. And here is my course outcome: understand, describe inferential statistics and other underlying probability scores. This is from a statistics class that I teach. So what I'm really interested in is which course outcomes seem to be the best match for this first sub-competency. So I'm going to sort this from largest to smallest, and now you can see I get some nice high scores here. And so this first one starts out, and now I can look a little more closely and make a judgment. Is this something that I think is going to be a good mapping or not? And I don't actually teach this first course, but let's just see what it is based on this. So I'm not too familiar with this particular course, but the competency is translate evidence from nursing science as well as other sciences into practice. And the sub-competency and the outcome is describe the process of implementing evidence-based practice. So, you know, that's a fairly good alignment, I think. This is something that we could go back to the course instructor and say, you know, would you say this is a match? But it looks pretty good to me. This next one is another course, analyze the role and limitations of statistical inference in evidence-based practice. This is another course in one of our graduate programs. Also, you know, not a bad match. So you can kind of look at this as a bit of a recommendation engine for trying to make these mappings, and at least this gets you in the ballpark for trying to find which course outcomes might be addressing specific AACN Essentials sub-competencies. This one's one of our capstone courses, describe and compare different roles within the specialty practice of nursing informatics. So in that capstone course is probably a good one for addressing some of this first competency. So translating evidence, that's probably, it's related, but you know, may not be addressing that particular sub-competency well, so I would probably not use that particular one. But as you can see, this does kind of bring to the top the things that seem to be a decent match or a potential match, and not too hard because this is in Excel. You can go through and look at each sub-competency and then see, you know, what is a higher ranking here. So I thought this is a potential tool that might help speed up some of the mapping process by trying to match up particular course outcomes with AACN sub-competencies. As I've thought about this a bit more, I don't think this would necessarily have to be limited to looking at course outcomes. I think you could easily make a list of course assignments and use an assignment description in here and match up some assignment descriptions with AACN sub-competencies. So that may be another approach that I don't know exactly how AACN is going to do their certification process with different schools and how much evidence they're going to be looking for that these things are covered, but particular assignments actually might be a useful thing to look at too. So that might be something that rather than just course outcomes, we could go down to the assignment level and run this same type of report and see what potential assignments might match with some of these sub-competencies. Eventually, I actually will probably look at, you know, I'll be mostly interested in looking at what are the maximum scores for some of these in the whole column. So if I put in a formula up here, I left myself a little bit of space that I actually could look at these, and I'd be interested in finding what is the highest match or score on any of these sub-competencies. So I wanted to leave myself a little room that I could pull some extra information out. As you can see, a lot of these are up at 0.5, 0.6, but I'm also interested in seeing do any of these sub-competencies not score highly with anything. And so you'll see this one here as a 0.38. That's a lot lower than others. Foster opportunities for intentional presence in practice. So none of my course outcomes seem to be a good match for that. Although as I look at that, some of my capstone courses and projects might be a good fit for that. But this might be a quick way for a program to identify where they may not have good representation among their course outcomes when it comes to the AACN Essentials, because many of us may need to go through and add something in our program that addresses an essential a little bit better. So I'm just trying to see if there's anything that's obviously low among the top here, lower than that one that we just looked at. And here's another one that's a 0.3. Facilitate difficult conversations and disclosure of sensitive information. So I may not have in any of my courses, a specific outcome that addresses that. And that may be, as we all know, some course outcomes, there's sometimes other things covered in courses that may not be well represented in their specific formal outcomes. And so this might be a place where if I looked at some of my assignments and did a match, would any of those assignments in a course perhaps match with that? But none of my outcomes seem to be a really high match for that. Here's another one. Foster caring relationships. So none of my outcomes were too specific. So this might be an area too where it might give me a little bit of guidance on if I needed to beef up some of my descriptions in my outcomes. That may be helpful. But this might give a really quick view or some insight quickly in a whole program of where things seem to be covered and not covered, and some direction on what things maybe to address in a program. So I thought this might be useful. So I hope this description is useful for anybody else that's working on this particular problem. And this tool really does look like something that might point the way a little bit and facilitate this mapping process rather than it be so manual, because having so many sub-competencies with many course outcomes really puts a lot of cognitive burden on those trying to do this type of mapping and matching, and this might be a way to lift some of that burden and speed things up and help there be a little less time in this very tedious process, and perhaps this could speed things up and let us spend more time working on actual course content and not getting slogged down in the mapping process. I hope this helps, and I will look forward to making more progress on this.